This morning we hear of two resurrection appearances. In the first one, Saul is knocked down by a blinding light, a dramatic and life-changing experience for Saul. And if you don't remember the story, this same Saul became Paul. And the Apostle Paul, which makes up most of the epistles in our New Testament, was basically responsible for being a missionary to the entire Mediterranean world. Probably the greatest missionary in Christian history. But he started out as a Jew who really hated those Christians. When we hear the story of our patron saint, St. Stephen, who was stoned to death for proclaiming Christ, there's a little detail they throw into that story. There was a man by the name of Saul who took care of the coats, so those throwing the stones could throw them even better because they weren't burdened by their coats. That young man named Saul, who was part of the execution of St. Stephen, is the same Paul who wrote so much of the New Testament. In the second resurrection appearance, the disciples are getting tired of waiting for Jesus to come back. Remember, Jesus said, "I'll be right back." And they're getting tired of waiting for him. He's appeared to them twice now, but now there's been no sign of him. And so, of course, who would be the first one to get on with his life? It would be Peter. And Peter looks at them and said, "Well, I don't know what all you're going to do, but as for me, I'm going fishing." And they all said, "Okay, yeah, that sounds good. We'll go fishing with you." They don't catch anything. There's some stranger on the bank, though. And that stranger obviously is wearing Ray-Bans because he knows where the fish are. And he tells them, "Put down the nets on the other side." Well, and Jesus wasn't wearing Ray-Bans, but for some reason Jesus knew where the fish were. Then they figure out who it is, and we have all this weird running around and swimming. And Jesus finally invites them to a grilled breakfast on the shore. Jesus appeared one way to Paul, rather dramatically. By the way, Paul used the title apostle because he claims, in other words, to be an apostle, you had to meet Jesus face to face. Paul claimed that he met Jesus face to face on the road to Damascus, so he had a right to be an apostle. It took him a while till the other apostles finally bought into that, but eventually they did, and Paul got to use the title apostle. So Paul has this dramatic experience of Jesus on the road to Damascus. The disciples have a more domestic scene, having breakfast with Jesus. Each appearance was in a manner that would cause some kind of transformation of those around him, though. Each appearance was tailor-made for the needs of that person. So our question this morning to ask ourselves is, how has the risen Christ appeared to you? I'm going to unload that a little bit. First of all, when we talk about the appearance of the risen Christ, we're not talking about the second coming. Christians seem to get really distracted by all this rapture stuff. And maybe I have a personal bias. When I was a teenager, on Wednesday nights we went to my Uncle Dove's church. Uncle Dove was a Pentecostal pastor. And on Wednesday nights, Uncle Dove would preach from either the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation. Uncle Dove was into the rapture big time. So after a while, though, I had the rapture about up to here. So I'm not a big fan of it. We did just study the book, the Revelation to John, though. And I think we kind of came to the conclusion that it was primarily about things that had happened in John's time. In other words, it was the Roman Empire and Nero, what it was about. But there's other ways to interpret that book. But with apologies to Uncle Dove, I'm not talking about the second coming when I ask you, how has the risen Christ appeared to you? I'm speaking about encountering Christ right now. How have you encountered Christ, the risen Christ, in your life right now? There's going to be lots of different answers to that question, and I'm not sure any of them will be wrong. Just like the two appearances we heard about in today's reading, Christ, the Spirit of the living God, makes himself known to us in ways that are tailor-made to our particular needs. In some of the small groups I've participated in over the years, we often would start our weekly gathering by taking a few minutes to answer this question. What was your moment closest to Christ during the last week? There's no wrong answer to that question either. But as I heard answers from different people, it expanded my awareness of how to answer that question. It expanded my understanding of the ways that God touches us in our day-to-day lives. So pretty soon after hearing these other responses from people, I began to look for Christ in every situation. Let me explain that just a little bit. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's the incarnation. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, God incarnate, God chose to take on the limited form of a human being and dwell here on this earth within a human being. That's a phenomenal thing, but any time that something in the created realm reminds us of God, draws us to God, we could say that that is a moment when we were close to Christ in our day-to-day lives. So, for instance, I would hear people share things like, holding my grandchild on my lap was my moment closest to Christ. Watching the sun come up over the Atlantic Ocean was my moment closest to Christ. Anything from the created order is part of the incarnation. And if that moment draws you closer to Christ, closer to God, then that was your incarnational moment, your moment when you're closest to Christ. Maybe that makes it clear. Maybe I made it more complicated. I don't know. But let's talk about the 4 ways that we know that Christ is present here this morning within the Holy Eucharist. And this isn't my teaching. This is what the church teaches. And 3 of those ways you probably get. Sherry, don't say anything. Sherry was here last night, so she knows the answer. And she gets the one that everyone forgets. Okay, how is Christ made known to us in the Eucharist? First, in the people gathered. When 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I will be in their midst. Jesus promised us. There's more than 2 or 3 people here. We know that Christ is in our midst right now. As I mentioned last week, keep in mind that it's the people gathered who consecrate the bread and wine. It's through the people being gathered that the bread and wine become the body and blood. I'm just your representative, folks. So that's one way. Christ is present in the Holy Scriptures. As we engage ourselves with those texts, they come alive and speak to the various conditions of our lives. Through the Bible, through the testimony of those who have gone before us, our image of Christ with us right now becomes a bit clearer. Today we see the image of Christ as one who appears as a blinding light, but we also see the image of Christ as one who invites us to breakfast. Christ is present through your spiritual leaders. This is usually the one that people miss. Those who have been involved in holy orders, who can be a special conduit of God's grace. And the 4th one, and probably the one you all thought of, Christ is present to us in the bread and wine that we share as the body and blood of Christ. When we receive these gifts, we are strengthened in our union with Christ, and we are strengthened in our union with one another. Receiving Holy Communion is a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, a banquet that we are invited to today, a banquet that we are invited to for all of eternity. We will each encounter the risen Christ as we kneel at the altar for Holy Communion this morning. We will each encounter Christ as we visit with one another in the parish hall after the liturgy. We will also encounter the risen Christ as we return to our homes, as he dwells there with us in the midst of our families. Each and every day, expect an encounter with Christ. Every night, take a few minutes to ask yourself this question. What was my moment closest to Christ this day? And now, let us continue with our liturgy as we prepare to share breakfast with our risen Lord.